Counter-Rev Audio. April 2021. The Managerial Revolution, What is Happening in the World, by James Burnham. This edition published in 2019 by Endeavor Media Limited. Chapter 15. The German Way. When we have finished expressing our emotions about Germany by calling its society nihilism or barbarism or whatever similar epithet we prefer, we are still left with the scientific problem of describing just what kind of society it is and where it is going. It is obvious, when we think about it, that no organized society, and Nazi Germany is certainly a form of organized society, can actually be nihilistic, and barbarian, by etymology and ordinary usage, means simply foreign, different from ourselves. The serious attempts to analyze contemporary German society reduced to two. The majority view has been that Nazism is a type of capitalism, usually considered decadent capitalism, the degenerate last stage of capitalist society. A small but recently growing number of critics holds that Nazism is an early stage in a new form of society. This latter group, however, has not been clear about what kind of society this new form may be. Does the spectacular energy of present-day Germany represent the hideous convulsions of a death agony, or the, also hideous, let us remember, pangs of birth? This is a question that we must answer if we are to understand what is happening in the world. The dispute can easily become merely verbal. No one will deny that there are in German society elements which it shares with traditional capitalist society, and, equally, no one will deny that there are many other elements in German society not found in traditional capitalism. It might seem, therefore, that we could give either answer that we might choose. But for us the problem is not verbal. We have defined what we mean by capitalism, by socialism, and by managerial society. We are interested, here as elsewhere, not in the static condition of the moment, but in the trend of development, the direction of change. With this background, we are inquiring into facts, not words, when we ask whether Germany today is a type of capitalism or whether it is in the first developmental stages of a new order of society, specifically, managerial society. A preliminary observation, to which I have already referred, must be repeated. By a decadent society, I shall mean no more than a type of society which is nearing its end in time and history. There are many who call Nazi Germany decadent because its rulers lie a great deal, are treacherous, break treaties, exile, imprison, torture, and murder worthy human beings. It is a fact that the Nazi rulers often carry out such actions, though such actions are more common among all rulers of all times than our moralists like us to believe. But it is not at all a fact that such actions are typical signs of decadence. It would be altogether impossible to establish any necessary link between lies, terror, tyranny on the one side and historical decadence on the other. Indeed, if historical experience establishes any correlation in this matter, it is probably a negative one, that is, the young, new, rising social order is, as against the old, more likely to resort on a large scale to lies, terror, persecution. Tragedy always seems more heroic than worldly success, ideal characters we usually are taught to find on the losing side. Hector was the noblest hero of the Trojan War, it was the Greeks who introduced the treacherous Trojan horse, but the Greeks won. The splendid personal traits of many of the late feudal lords did not prevent them and their system from going down in ruins. By the time of Cervantes those traits were the subject for nostalgic ridicule, not for imitation. There is no historical law that polite manners and justice shall conquer. In history there is always the question of whose manners and whose justice. A rising social class and a new order of society have got to break through the old moral codes just as they must break through the old economic and political institutions. Naturally, from the point of view of the old, they are monsters. If they win, they take care in due time of manners and morals. All orthodox Marxists believe that Nazi Germany is a form of decadent capitalism. They put it in this way: fascism is the political organization of capitalism in decay, it is the extreme end point of monopoly finance capitalism. In reality, this opinion follows simply from the crucial assumption which we have so frequently met, the assumption that socialism is the only alternative to capitalism. Nazism certainly is not the free, classless society of socialism. Consequently, by virtue of the assumption, it must be a type of capitalism. This deduction, granted the assumption, is perfectly sound, and saves all the bother of a careful examination of what is actually happening. This belief is by no means confined to Marxists. It is held also by many capitalists. In particular, it was held, prior to 1933, by a large section of the German capitalists who were, after all, the ones most intimately concerned. The opinion of this section was summed up by a remarkable article published in the late summer of 1932 in one of the journals of German heavy industry, and reproduced in the Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. 1. This article is well worth quoting at some length. The problem of consolidating the capitalist regime in post-war Germany is governed by the fact that the leading section, that is, the capitalist controlling industry, has become too small to maintain its rule alone. Unless recourse is to be had to the extremely dangerous weapon of purely military force, it is necessary for it to link itself with sections which do not belong to it from a social standpoint, but which can render it the essential service of anchoring its rule among the people, and thereby becoming its special or last defender. This last or outermost defender of bourgeois rule, in the first period after the war, was social democracy. National Socialism has to succeed social democracy in providing a mass support for capitalist rule in Germany. Social democracy had a special qualification for this task, which up to the present National Socialism lacks. Thanks to its character as the original party of the workers, social democracy, in addition to its purely political force, also had the much more valuable and permanent advantage of control over organized labor, and by paralyzing its revolutionary energies chained it firmly to the capitalist state. In the first period of reconsolidation of the capitalist regime after the war, the working class was divided by the wages victories and social political measures through which the Social Democrats canalized the revolutionary movement. The deflection of the revolution into social political measures corresponded with the transference of the struggle from the factories and the streets into parliament and cabinets, that is, with the transformation of the struggle from below into concessions from above. From then onwards, therefore, the social democratic and trade union bureaucracy, and with them also the section of the workers whom they led, were closely tied to the capitalist state and participation in its administration, at least so long as there was anything left of their post-war victories to defend by these means, and so long as the workers followed their leadership. This analysis leads to four important conclusions. 1. The policy of the lesser evil is not merely tactical, it is the political essence of social democracy. 2. The cords which bind the trade union bureaucracy to the state method from above are more compelling than those which bind them to Marxism, and therefore to social democracy, and this holds in relation to the bourgeois state which wants to draw in this bureaucracy. 3. The links between the trade union bureaucracy and social democracy stand or fall, from a political standpoint, with parliamentarism. 4. The possibility of a liberal social policy for monopoly capitalism is conditioned by the existence of an automatic mechanism for the creation of divisions in the working class. A capitalist regime which adopts a liberal social policy must not only be entirely parliamentary, it must also be based on social democracy and must allow social democracy to have sufficient gains to record. A capitalist regime which puts an end to these gains must also sacrifice parliamentarism and social democracy, must create a substitute for social democracy and pass over to a social policy of constraint. The process of this transition, in which we are at the moment, for the reason that the economic crisis has perforce blotted out the gains referred to, has to pass through the acutely dangerous stage, when, with the wiping out of these gains, the mechanism for the creation of divisions in the working class which depended on them also ceases to function, the working class moves in the direction of communism, and the capitalist rule approaches the emergency stage of military dictatorship. The only safeguard from this acute stage is if the division and holding back of the working class, which the former mechanism can no longer adequately maintain, is carried out by other and more direct methods. In this lie the positive opportunities and tasks of National Socialism. If National Socialism succeeds in bringing the trade unions into a social policy of constraint, as social democracy formerly succeeded in bringing them into a liberal policy, then National Socialism would become the bearer of one of the functions essential to the future of capitalist rule, and must necessarily find its place in the state and social system. The danger of a state capitalist or even socialistic development, which is often urged against such an incorporation of the trade unions under National Socialist leadership, will in fact be avoided precisely by these means. There is no third course between a reconsolidation of capitalist rule and the communist revolution. In connection with this brilliant analysis, let us note in passing its confirmation of the estimate we have previously made of the social role of social democracy, the reformist wing of Marxism, as a capitalist movement. But let us remark, second, that this analysis coincides exactly with the Leninist analysis. If its source were not given, there would be no way of telling whether it came from a capitalist or a Leninist pen. 2. Naturally, neither reformism nor liberalism could produce such a critique. Most important of all, along with Leninism, it shares the basic assumption: socialism, communism, is the only alternative to capitalism. It is its reliance upon this assumption that finally brings the analysis, in spite of its brilliance, to grief. Even, however, apart from the assumption, the analysis was plausible in 1932, when it was made. It expressed, we might say, a chance, and the only chance, for capitalism to take. But 1941 is 9 years later. We have the experience of 9 more years to learn from. The lesson of this experience conclusively refutes the analysis of 1932. The view that Nazism was a type of capitalism, a late, or the last, stage of capitalism, had a reasonable probability on the evidence a decade ago. It was a belief capable of verification. The verification would have been found in the tendency of Nazism to strengthen or at least maintain the typical institutions of capitalism and the power and privileges of the capitalists. The Italian experiences had not been conclusive. There was no way to decide the problem with confidence beforehand. By now it has been decided. The decision refutes the theory that Nazism is a form of capitalism. The view that Nazified Germany is decadent capitalism, the political organization of capitalism in decay, is prima facie implausible in 1941, no matter how legitimate a guess it was in 1932. As compared with the undoubtedly capitalist nations of France, before her fall, and England, and the United States, too, and relying upon the analogies that may be drawn from comparable historical situations, Germany exhibits the signs not at all of decadence but of social revolution, of the transition to a new structure of society. Before reviewing some of the more important of these signs, let us recall the extraordinary handicaps faced by Germany at the conclusion of the First World War. She had just been defeated in the greatest war fought up to that time and had been compelled to sign the harshest peace terms in modern European history. Important sections of her territory had been lopped off, and she had been surrounded by satellite states of her enemies. She had been stripped of her colonies, her merchant marine, and her navy, and her army was reduced to a minimum figure. Her people had been exhausted by the war and by the famine which occurred during its last year. She was saddled with reparations not merely in money, which she could and did pay largely through borrowings, but in kind, which latter meant the loss of material goods. Her opponents had carved up all the juiciest slices of the world in what they took to be their own interests. It is against this background that we must place contemporary Germany. Nazi Germany eliminated unemployment within a couple of years from Hitler's ascension to power. The means whereby this was done are irrelevant to our inquiry, the fact that it was done is crucial. Mass unemployment is the primary indication of the collapse of a given form of society. The great capitalist powers have proved that they cannot get rid of mass unemployment under capitalist institutions. Even after a year and a half of war, after more than half a year of the Battle of Britain, there were still, according to official figures, which probably understate the facts and besides do not include so-called unemployables, nearly 1 million unemployed in England. Nazi Germany's elimination of unemployment is, in and by itself, a sufficient proof that Germany has left the basis of capitalism and entered the road of a new form of society. Everyone knows and many have stated that it is not by virtue of the capitalist elements remaining in German culture that unemployment has been got rid of, but through the introduction of non-capitalist methods. Similarly, Germany has broken through the restrictions of capitalist finance. According to all the laws of capitalism, Germany should have been bankrupt 5 years ago, its currency should have gone into a wild inflation, it should have been impossible for the state to finance its vast undertakings. But, under the state control of finance, none of the laws held. Again, through state control of imports and exports, Germany has been able to carry on foreign trade without the means, according to capitalist standards, of doing so. And huge outlets, primarily in state enterprises, have been found for the investment funds that sit idly in the banks of the great capitalist powers. In territory, Germany has been expanding rapidly, first in peace and now in war. The expansion is not confined to lands brought formally within the boundaries of the Reich but includes also the nations drawn within the Reich's sphere of influence. Rapid territorial expansion has always been a sign not of decadence. Societies break up in their decadent period, but of renewal. Germany makes war better than the undoubtedly capitalist nations. If we take into account the difficulties that Germany had to overcome in preparation for war, compared to France and Britain with their immensely greater material resources, the superiority of Germany's war-making is far more striking even than it seems. As in the case of rapid territorial expansion, the ability to make war well is never a sign of decadence but of its opposite. By all reliable accounts and by common experience, Nazi Germany inspires in millions of persons a fanatical loyalty. This, too, never accompanies decadence. The subjects of a decadent regime tend to be characterized by indifference, cynicism, or at most a dogged and rather weary devotion to duty. A further striking outward sign is the fact that the outstanding political, military, and economic leaders of Germany are much younger, averaging probably a generation younger, than the leaders of France and Britain. To carry on the new war, England and France had to rest on the old men who had been leaders in the First World War and were none too young even then. In Germany, there are new men and, comparatively, young men. This difference symbolizes well the fact that the social systems of England and France at the outset of the Second World War were remnants of the past, Germany's a start toward the future. Finally, there is the notorious Nazi fifth column. The term fifth column is used so loosely, meaning often no more than those whom a speaker or writer disagrees with, that its full significance is lost sight of. All modern nations have spies and paid agents in other nations, including enemy nations. These do not constitute a fifth column in the distinctive sense of the term. The Nazi fifth column is made up of persons within other nations who are more loyal to Nazi Germany, or to the general conception of life of which Nazism is one embodiment, than they are to the nation of which they are residents and perhaps citizens, and to its conception of life. This is why genuine fifth columns, whether Nazi or Stalinist, cannot be wiped out. Wiping them out is not a question of catching spies and intelligence agents at work. It would have to include changing innermost feelings, loyalties, ideologies, and the propaganda based on capitalist ideologies is no longer strong enough to do this fully. Hitler, like Stalin, can always count on a fifth column in every nation. Such a phenomenon is intelligible only if Hitler and Stalin both represent a social revolutionary force, a force which cuts across and through the boundaries of capitalist nationalism. So long as capitalism was established as the world system with all nations part of it, any considerable development of a fifth column was impossible. The rise of the fifth column marks the breakdown of capitalist nationalism, of the capitalist nation as the ultimate political entity. This prima facie evidence is sufficient to refute the opinion that Nazi Germany is a type of capitalism and to show that it is on the contrary an early stage of a new type of society. This evidence corresponds also with the underlying longer-term facts. The managerial developments did not begin in Germany with Hitler. Rather is Hitler's rise to power a phase of the basic managerial developments and a political expression of the fact that during these last 8 years Germany has been turning the corner from the down road of decadent capitalism, with managerial intrusions, to the up road of early managerial society, with capitalist remnants. We find in Germany to an ever-increasing degree those structural changes which we have discovered to be characteristic of the shift from capitalism to managerial society. In the economic sphere, there is a steady reduction, in all senses, of the area of private enterprise, and a correlative increase of state intervention. There was a brief period, immediately following the Nazi accession to state power, when the trend seemed to be in the opposite direction, when even a few enterprises which had been under state operation in the Weimar Republic were handed back to private capitalists. But this quickly reversed. The state intervention in the economy occurs in numerous directions. Outright state ownership and operation, advancing in all fields, are particularly ascendant in the extensive areas of new enterprise opened up during the Nazi rule. However, to confine attention to outright ownership and operation with all legal formalities would be deceptive. Virtually all economic enterprise is subject to rigid state control, and it is control which we have seen to be decisive in relation to the instruments of production. Legal forms, even income privileges, are in the end subordinate to de facto control. Even where private owners still exist in Germany, the decisions about their property are not in their hands. They do not decide what to make or not to make. They do not establish prices or bargain about wages. They are not at liberty to buy the raw materials they might choose nor to seek the most profitable markets. They cannot, as a rule, decide how to invest or not invest their surplus funds. In short, they are no longer owners, no longer effective capitalists, whatever certificates they may have in their deposit boxes. The regulation of production in Germany is no longer left to the market. What is to be produced, and how much, is decided, deliberately, by groups of men, by the state boards and bureaus and commissions. It is they that decide whether a new plant shall be built or an old plant retired, how raw materials shall be allotted and orders distributed, what quotas must be fulfilled by various branches of industry, what goods shall be put aside for export, how prices shall be fixed and credit and exchange extended. There is no requirement that these decisions of the bureaus must be based on any profit aim in the capitalist sense. If it is thought expedient, for whatever reason, to produce, for example, an ersatz rubber or wool or food, this will be done even if the production entails, from a capitalist point of view, a heavy loss. Similarly, in order to accumulate foreign exchange or to stimulate some political effect in a foreign nation, goods will be exported regardless of loss. A factory may be compelled to shut down, even though it could operate at a high profit. Banks and individuals are forced to invest their funds with no reference to their private and voluntary opinions about risks from a profit standpoint. It is literally true to say that the Nazi economy, already, is not a profit economy. The workers, on their side, are no longer the free proletarians of capitalism. Under Nazism the workers are, indeed, free from unemployment. At the same time they cannot, as individuals or through their own independent organizations, bargain for wages or change jobs at will. They are assigned to their tasks, and their labor conditions are fixed, by the decisions of the state bureaus and commissions. Millions of them are allotted to the vast state enterprises. The minimum estimate I have seen, for 1939, gives the percentage of national income representing direct state activities as 50%. With the reduction in the area of private enterprise and the increase of state enterprise, goes also a corresponding reduction in the social position of the private capitalists. So far as control over the instruments of production goes, the capitalists are already near the bottom. As to income privilege, a recent estimate by a New York statistician gives as a mere 5% the share of the German national income going to profits and interest. This is a substantial reduction from the 1933 figures, in spite of a huge increase in the total national income, which, under capitalism, would normally be accompanied by a percentage increase in profits. In the United States, profits and interest are 20% of the national income, even excluding all so-called entrepreneurial profits. Moreover, of the German capitalists' 5%, the greater part is appropriated by the state as taxes and contributions. The statistics, however, which are, in any case, not reliable, fail to indicate the full meaning. The German capitalists as capitalists, not necessarily always as individuals functioning in other capacities, because of their loss of control over the instruments of production, a loss which leads progressively to their loss of legal ownership rights and of income, slip from their position as the ruling class in Germany. They become, more and more, simply tolerated pensioners, rapidly approaching social impotence. This reduction toward impotence of the capitalists is accompanied by the rise of precisely the class which we found to be at the top in Russia, the managers, together with their bureaucratic and military colleagues. This is the class, in which some individual capitalists have found a place, that even today in Germany holds the largest share of control over the instruments of production, wields the effective power, and already is receiving the lion's share of the privileges. Even in Nazi law, the position of the manager is beginning to be openly recognized. For example, it is the de facto manager of a factory who has final say, subject to certain bureaus and state-controlled courts, about labor disputes, that is, has the right of controlling access to the instruments of production, and is backed by the state in that right. How strange that it has not yet been remarked how seldom we find a manager among the voluntary or forced exiles from Nazi Germany. There are artists and writers among the exiles, ideologists and politicians, unassimilable foes of the new regime, storekeepers and professionals and teachers, and not a few capitalists, both Jews and Christians. But almost never a manager. It is strange that this has not been remarked, but not strange that it is the case. For the managers realize that the society which is developing is their society. In short, Germany is today a managerial state in an early stage. Structurally, it is less advanced along managerial lines than Russia. It retains as yet more capitalist elements. There is, we might almost say, a dual social structure at present in Germany. The managerial institutions and modes of operation are growing and expanding inside the still existing cocoon of capitalism, which lingers as a protective coating and at the same time hides the life within. The direction counts, and the direction is toward the dropping of the remaining capitalist elements. But, though structurally less advanced, Germany is without most of those major weaknesses which we noted in the case of Russia. Its industrial and technological foundation is far stronger, the rising managerial class is much larger, better trained, more able. This is why Hitler had no qualms about the Russian Pact. He knew that, in the pact, Russia was the minor partner. Many commentators believe that they adequately sum up present-day Germany, including all those features of German society which I have been listing, by saying that Germany has a war economy. In their dismissal of all problems with the help of this magic reference to a war economy there lies a whole series of grave misconceptions. In the first place, we must realize that all economies are war economies. To suppose that a war economy is some special and peculiar kind of economy rests on the naive assumption that war is something special and peculiar in the history of human societies. The truth is that war, up to the present and into the discernible future, is a normal and integral part of all human societies. All social groups, tribes, empires, city-states, nations including all capitalist nations, have made war constantly. The majority of the time, and this holds for all the capitalist nations, they have actually been at war, actually fighting some other group. When not fighting, they have been recovering from a previous fight and simultaneously getting ready for the next one. Our moral beliefs are such as to make us like to think that war is an exceptional type of event. The facts are that it is not. To say this is not to praise war or consider it a good thing but only to tell the truth. It is ridiculous to say that Nazi Germany has a war economy and England and France do not, or did not. It was simply that Nazi Germany had a better, a more effective, war economy than her rivals, taking comparative material resources into account, a much better war economy. England and France won the First World War, and arranged the world in the way that they thought best suited their war aims. Before that war had ended, they began preparing for the Second World War. No one noticed England sinking its fleet, raising its ocean bases, or France dropping universal conscription or building workers' houses instead of the Maginot Line. In the second place, it is not true that all war economies are alike. Calling a given economy a war economy tells us nothing. Societies prepare for and make war after the manner of such societies as they are. In wartime, perhaps, the social relations are drawn somewhat tighter, they are not fundamentally altered. A feudal society doesn't cease being feudal when it makes war, as the ruling class of feudal society did all the time, since it had hardly anything else to do. A capitalist nation doesn't cease being capitalist when it starts war, it fights its capitalist wars capitalistically. It is not even true that a democratic nation ceases to be democratic when it fights. Did England and the United States stop being democracies during the many wars they fought in the 19th century? They were capitalist democracies, and they fought as capitalist democracies. If it is objected that modern war is different, is total war and must be fought by totalitarian methods, then the answer is, yes, modern war is indeed different, and the reason for this difference is that modern war is ceasing to be capitalist war. The First World War was the last great war of capitalist society. Already in that war, though to a less extent than is now remembered, the belligerent states found it necessary to modify their institutions sharply in order to carry on the war. The Second World War is the first great war of managerial society. In this war the capitalist institutions no longer have a chance of winning. In order to win the war, these institutions must be transformed. This does not mean changing just for the duration. It is war that decides the survival of social systems as well as of nations. The fact that the way to win wars is changing is only a phase of the larger fact that society as a whole is changing. Third, we must observe that war economies are not only war economies. War is an integral part of social development in history as it happens, and therefore much more than just fighting comes as a consequence of, or in connection with, war measures. It may be an absurd and shocking waste that roads are built, transportation and communication expanded, more goods sold, inventions stimulated, houses constructed, in connection with preparing and fighting a war, but, as things are, this may be and often is the case. What we call things depends upon the interests we predominantly have with reference to them. If, in the light of our present chief interests and fears, we call the Nazi economy a war economy, we might equally well, from other points of view, call it a full employment economy or a housing economy that has built nearly 2 million workers' houses, or the auto speedway economy or the airplane economy. During the 5 years from 1933, when Hitler took power, to 1938, German armament production increased 300%, but the production and distribution of the basic goods, such as food and clothing, upon which the real standard of living rests, increased also, by a full third. 3. Finally, it must be observed that, if one type of economic structure enables one nation to fight a war better than it can be fought with other types of economy, then all nations within the sphere of operations of the given nation, which today means the whole world, must adopt that type of economy. This may be regrettable, but it obviously follows. If fighting with guns is more effective than fighting with bows and arrows, and if economy A can produce lots of guns and economy B only bows and arrows, then the nation with economy A is sure to conquer the nation with economy B unless the latter nation adopts the A type of economy. If the managerial structure of economy is superior, as it clearly is, to the capitalist structure for war purposes, then for that reason alone, even if there were not, as there are, many other reasons, capitalist economy would have to give way, on a world scale, to managerial economy. The pattern of the German way to managerial society is, in notable respects, different from the pattern of the Russian way. This difference in pattern is one of the chief of those factors which have obscured the identity and historical direction between the developments in the two countries. We saw that the Russian solution of the managerial triple problem goes roughly in the following order. 1. Speedy elimination of the capitalists at home, together with the staving off of the capitalists abroad. 2. The more gradual and drawn-out curbing of the masses under the managerial institutions. 3. The contest to come with rival sectors of the managers. The basic German pattern reverses the first two stages, which yields, 1. The fairly rapid curbing of the masses, in order to prevent a repetition of the Russian pattern and to forestall a breakthrough toward a free, classless society, together with the alignment of the masses under a managerial ideology and to an increasing extent under managerial institutions. 2. The more gradual reduction of the home capitalists to impotence, combined with direct onslaught against the capitalists abroad and the institutional bulwarks of world capitalism. 3. The contest to come with rival sectors of the managers. The pattern of the German way thus permits the utilization of the capitalists and the curbing of the masses along managerial lines, the first stage, and then the utilization of the pressure of the masses for the reduction of the capitalists, the second stage. The managerial curbing of the masses does not mean only a physical terror directed against the masses. Physical terror is, in the long run, secondary to the job of winning the minds and feelings of the masses to a set of attitudes the consequences of which are the abandonment of both capitalism and the fight for socialism, and the acceptance of the managers and the institutions of managerial society. It was just here that the capitalists helped prepare for their own later ruin. Their support of the Nazis did block a repetition of the pattern of the Russian way in Germany. The masses were curbed, but the curbing was accomplished along lines that in the end are incompatible with the maintenance of capitalist rule and prepare only for the victory of the managers. This apparently was suspected by the German capitalists, as indicated in the last paragraph of the quotation which I have cited above. Nevertheless, the action of the capitalists, or a section of them, in making what seemed to be an alliance with Nazism was probably justified under the circumstances. The only alternative was the Russian way. That would have meant drastic and rapid elimination. The Nazi way gave the capitalists a breathing space, was at least slower in tempo from their point of view. Bad as the chance was, it was at least better than the alternative. As it turns out, the chance was not good enough. The German way is slower, even now. After 8 years, the German capitalists are not finished, but it is merely a slower death as against a quick one. One other, and this a real, advantage accrued to the capitalists, not as a class but as individuals, from the German way. It gave some of them more opportunity, as individuals, to fuse themselves into the new order, to become managers as some feudal lords became capitalists. Thus, as individuals, they are able to survive the disappearance of their class, to take, in fact, their place in the new ruling class. This is exactly what the more vigorous and technically best trained of the German capitalists have been doing. The pattern of the German way, like the Russian pattern, is capable of approximate repetition elsewhere. It was natural for Germany, holding, of all the great nations, the poorest cards in the capitalist deck, to be the first of the great nations to turn vigorously toward the new social structure, just as it was natural for France, England, and the United States, with the most favorable capitalist hands, to resist the turn most bitterly. Why should they want to take the risk of a new deck when they are doing at least better than anyone else with the old? Germany, unlike Russia, had an advanced industry and technology, an advanced culture, and a large and trained body of managers. It is perhaps these factors that dictated the difference between the German pattern and the Russian. The Nazi assumption of power, as we saw, swung Germany from the decadent stages of capitalism with increasing managerial intrusions into the initial stages of managerial society, with, at first, considerable, capitalist leftovers. Internally, Germany still remains in an early stage. However, it was impossible to complete the internal revolution without at once going over to the more grandiose external tasks of the managerial future. Excluding Russia from consideration here, Nazism gave Germany, we might say, a head start over the other great powers in getting ready for the managerial world system. As we noticed, the natural focus of one of the future superstates is the area of advanced industry in Europe. The German boundaries already, in 1933, included a big share of this area. The first great external political task was the extension of Germany's strategic base to cover, directly or indirectly, the entire European area of advanced industry, which automatically meant de facto authority over Europe as a whole. In 1935, the extension began, with the victory in the Saar plebiscite. From that time on it has gone steadily smashing outward. The Nazi success, year after year, can only be explained by the ever-increasing weakness of the capitalist structure of society. Germany still retained much of capitalism, it is true, but her strength in relation to the other powers was derived, not from the capitalist elements in German society, which she shared with France and England, but from the managerial elements wherein she differed from them. The first series of extensions of the base were achieved peacefully. The Saar, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Memel were incorporated. Unquestionably the Nazis were glad to avoid war. What had they to lose from the peaceful extensions? The Nazis would have gone on by peace, so long as the aims were reached. Peace, or only minor fighting, was preferable. Finally, in 1939, capitalist France and England realized that the continuation of the process meant their death and that the process was going to continue. They had tried all means to avoid war, to hide from themselves what was happening. But Munich was of no more use than threats. Desperately, if any war was ever entered upon desperately, they took the field. The Nazis would still have been willing to win without fighting, why not? Or to fight only the easy Polish War. They thought, no doubt, that the announcement of the Soviet Pact might head off major war. And, after conquering Poland, Hitler again tried for a deal. But the issue for England and France was now plainly national and social survival, and they took the plunge. Germany had, of course, to accept the challenge. The first part of the Second World War, up to the fall of France in June 1940, was in reality the continuation of the strategic extension begun in 1935. This phase, the consolidation of the European base, was completed with France's surrender. It is completed irreversibly and can no longer be undone whatever the outcome of the succeeding phases of the war, which are really other wars. This consolidation, fundamental to the world politics of managerial society, is not going to be dissolved, not even if the present German regime is utterly defeated. In fact, no one expects it to be, not even the English statesmen. The day of a Europe carved into a score of sovereign states is over. If the states remain, they will be little more than administrative units in a larger collectivity. Any attempt to redivide Europe would collapse, not in the 20 years it took the Versailles system to collapse, but in 20 months. With the completion of the first phase of the war, Germany was naturally willing to have the war end. Again, why not? With the continental base consolidated, England by itself would be economically and socially helpless, and would have to gravitate into the general European orbit. Therefore, after France's surrender, Hitler again offered peace and throughout the summer of 1940 was clearly trying for a deal with England harder than he was trying to conquer her by military means. From the time of Mein Kampf onward, Hitler has recognized that a deal between Germany and England would be much more advantageous to the European superstate of the future than to have England conquered by Germany. With a deal, in which England would necessarily be subordinate, the tendency would be for the British Empire to keep attached to the European Central area. In the course of the military conquest of England, most of the empire tends to drop off to the spheres of the United States and the Asiatic Central area. But the English capitalists weighed the costs and decided to keep on fighting. Thus the second phase of the war, really a second war, goes on as I write. In this phase, with most of the strategic European base consolidated, the effect is to wreck capitalists and capitalist institutions abroad, in the first instance, the British Empire, greatest and most typical capitalist institution. Interestingly enough, this phase thus begins before the task of reducing the German home capitalists to impotence is finished. Such overlappings are common in history. The general outcome of the Second War is also assured. It is assured because it does not depend upon a military victory by Germany, which is in any case likely. The hopelessness of the position of the British capitalists has been shown from the beginning of the Second World War by the fact that they have absolutely no peace plans, war aims. During the first year and a half of the war, their spokesmen did not even pretend to be able to formulate war aims. If they finally make some sort of statement, it will be empty of all meaningful content. They cannot have war aims, peace plans, because there is no possible solution on a capitalist basis. England, no matter with what non-European allies, cannot conceivably hope to conquer the European continent, and could no longer run the continent if she could conquer. Revolutions on the continent, even if they should get rid of the Hitler regime, cannot benefit England. Nor could they repartition Europe into independent, fully sovereign states. The same general result would follow them as a Hitler military victory, the consolidation of the European strategic base, with England compelled to integrate into it. Military ups and downs, mass revolts, can alter the time schedule for this general outcome, can mean more or less chaos in the intervening period, but there is no prospect of its being essentially changed. But the consolidation of the European Central Area does not end the world political process. There remain the contests with the other sections of the managers, with Russia as we have already seen, and the struggles among the European, the Asiatic, and the American centers for their respective shares in the rest of the world. Though the perspective of these wars stretches into the future, their first actions are already beginning, overlapping the second phase of the Second World War. By the end of 1940 it was clear that the focus of the war was shifting, that the result of the European struggle was in fundamentals decided and that a new, third, phase was beginning wherein the mighty opponents of the future, the three political structures based on the three central areas, were undertaking their first trials of strength. The voice of Chamberlain, Churchill, Bevan, and England was giving place to that of Roosevelt in the United States. These wars of the developing superstates will not end with the end of this war. Their result, we have noted, is sure to be inconclusive, since none of the three central areas can firmly conquer any of the others. But they will be fought nonetheless, and in them the disposition of the rest of the world will be decided, and redecided. In a war such as started in September 1939, we may plainly observe the social revolutionary effect of the war process. Considering the war from the point of view of Germany, this revolutionary effect is threefold. In the first place, the Nazi armies carry the new and revolutionary ideas and institutions into the lands they conquer. Sometimes this is done by the direct imposition of these ideas and institutions upon the conquered peoples. But it also operates by contagion, or as a semi-voluntary consequence of military defeat, as in France. Second, the opposing nations discover that they can compete in war with Germany only by going over more and more, not merely to the same military means that Germany uses, but to the same type of institutions and ideas that characterize German society. This somewhat ironic relation holds: the surest way, the only way, to defeat Germany would be for the opposing nations to go over, not merely to institutions and ideas similar to those of Germany, but still further along the managerial road than Germany has yet gone. 4. Just as the strength of the German war-making machine is derived from her managerial, non-capitalist elements, combined with her advanced productive plant, so are her weaknesses in war-making the result chiefly of the remaining capitalist elements. Third, the war process speeds up the revolution inside Germany itself. In general, wars speed the tempo of the social tendencies which are present, but more leisurely, in peacetime. In the case of Germany now this is plainly apparent. The war-making means the still greater extension of the state throughout the economy, the still faster cutting off of the arena of private enterprise, the still further reduction to impotence of the already fatally undermined private capitalists, the still deeper reliance upon the managers and their bureaucratic and military colleagues as the only ones who can run the state, the still sharper penetration of the managerial ideologies. The direction is well marked by the increasing radicalization of Hitler's speeches as the war continues. The developments which have already taken place and those which may be confidently predicted for the near future exclude a reversal of the social direction which has been established in Germany. Germany, and with it the rest of Europe, are leaving capitalism behind, and moving toward the managerial structure of society. They are not going to shift back again. Capitalism is not going to be restored, but on the contrary what is left of capitalism is going to be eliminated. British and American capitalists may dream of a docile new Weimar Republic or of a friendly German monarchy or of a Europe pulverized into an even greater number of even smaller states than were left under Versailles. But the dream is absurd on the face of it. It couldn't work even in the 1920s. How infinitely less a chance is there for it to work in the 40s? The German capitalists also, no doubt, dream of a restored capitalism in Germany. If Germany is definitively victorious in the war, they presumably hope for a restored liberty, with unchecked rule, power and privileges once again securely in their hands. Even some of the Nazi politicians, perhaps even Hitler himself, have some such perspective as this. But it is too late, too much has happened. The servants have outgrown the masters. The institutions and the ideologies have been too profoundly altered. The managers and their allies know that they can wield the power, have been wielding it, why should they give it up? And the masses would not permit the reversal of direction. The road back to capitalism would mean, as the masses would see it, going back to the unemployment, the humiliations, the confusions, the moral and social pointlessness of 1932. However hard the lot of the masses under Nazism, they can see hope only further along the road that has been taken, not in a return. If the Hitler regime will not continue on this road, will not complete the reduction of the capitalists to impotence and the elimination of the leftovers of capitalism, then it will give way to a new regime, a regime differing from Hitler's not by being capitalist but by being a more matured representative of the managerial future. Two events of recent years, secondary in themselves, have been striking symbols of the fact that the social revolution in Germany cannot be reversed. The first was the retirement of Schacht from the front rank, the second, the exile of Thyssen. Schacht was not a big capitalist in his own right. He was a trained and expert representative of the capitalists. For the first years of Nazism, he continued as a capitalist representative, trying no doubt to guide events along the lines envisaged by the capitalists in the quotation I have given earlier in this chapter. The new regime welcomed him and used him. Then the revolution went beyond Schacht. Perhaps he, like the purged Russians, would have been willing to fuse himself into the managerial order. But, also like the Russian trials and executions, his virtual retirement was a ritualistic act in recognition of the dying of the old regime. Thyssen, on his side, was one of the biggest capitalists and prior to 1933 the leading supporter of the Nazis from among the big capitalists. The exile of Thyssen, and his subsequent renunciation of Nazism, signifies the recognition by German capitalism of the error in their original hope that Nazism could be the savior of German capitalism, their understanding that Nazism is merely a variant pattern in the liquidation of capitalism. None of this means, of course, that the revolution will be stabilized on the present Nazi lines. Present-day Nazism is, as all our previous discussion will have shown, a primitive stage of the managerial development of society. With the consolidation of the managerial social structure on a world scale, Nazism will fade into hardly recognizable forms. But the direction is established. Nor is the Germany of today the final type of the state of the future. What will emerge, as we have seen, will be a superstate based upon the European area of advanced industry. The Germany of 1933 and of now is the nuclear first stage in the development of that superstate. Chapter 16. The Future of the United States. During the past year or more, the doctrine of isolationism has been swinging out of public favor in the United States, and the isolationist politicians have become almost a laughingstock when they are not denounced as fifth columnists. As so often happens, however, sentiment has been changing for the wrong reasons. The usual argument is conducted over what might be called military isolationism, over the problem whether the United States can be successfully invaded by a foreign power. So far as the military dispute goes, the isolationists are in all probability correct. It is not a question of a few sporadic bombing or submarine raids, or even brief armed forays into a few sections of the country. Any foreign nation with enough nerve could accomplish these. But the definite conquest of continental United States by a foreign armed force is excluded for the discernible future. The oceans remain adequate barriers. Whoever began to have doubts should have had them quieted by witnessing what trouble 20 miles of channel caused the most powerful military machine in the history of the world. Nor can the idea of stage-by-stage conquest, from bases first established in South America, be taken any more seriously. Suppose a section of a foreign army did occupy a base in Brazil, for example. It could be inconvenient, true enough. However, a modern army doesn't fight with coffee beans and tropical plants. The only areas which can supply the needs of a modern army are the three central areas of advanced industry, in Europe, Asia, and the United States. The managers are indeed skillful, but they are not magicians enough to turn Brazil into a rival area of advanced industry in a month or a year or a decade. The fundamental problem of isolationism is hardly touched on by either side in the public dispute. This is the question not of military but of social isolationism. In connection with the social problem, most of the anti-isolationists share the opinions of their isolationist opponents, and both are 100% wrong. From a military standpoint, the continental United States remains, by and large, isolated from any serious threat from the rest of the world. From a social standpoint, the United States is linked unbreakably with all the rest of the modern world. Its ability to keep going depends upon its relations to the rest of the world. The same general social forces are at work in the United States as in the rest of the world. Geographical isolation and the incomparable material advantages which the United States has had in the past delay slightly the development of these social forces, but they are operating here as surely as everywhere else. If we review what has been happening in the United States during the past 10 or 15 years, we find the same long-term factors that we have noticed in the case of the other great powers, the factors, namely, that are involved in the dissolution of capitalist society and the growth of the managerial structure of society. The United States, certainly, has not escaped mass unemployment nor permanent agricultural depression nor colossally growing debt nor idle capital funds nor the inability to utilize technological possibilities. If the reduction in the area of private enterprise in the total economy is as yet behind that in Russia and Germany, the tendency and direction are no less unmistakable. As in other nations, the reduction is twofold in character: an ever greater percentage of enterprise is conducted outright by the state, and to an ever firmer extent the rest of enterprise is subject to state controls. In the United States, very conspicuously, the great private capitalists have been withdrawing from direct contact with production, traveling from direct supervision of the instruments of production to finance to occasional directors' meetings to almost complete economic retirement. By this course, they give up, more and more, the de facto control of the instruments of production, upon which social rule in the end rests. Correlatively, more and more of the control over production, both within the arena of private enterprise and in the state, goes into the hands of the managers. In the United States, as plainly as everywhere else, the capitalist ideologies lose their power to move the masses. And in the United States the political structural changes proceed in managerial directions with most evident and rapid speed. This is not all. Already in the United States, the tendency away from capitalism and toward managerial society has received a specific native ideological and institutional expression. This expression, suited to an earlier stage in the process than that reached in Russia or Germany, is the New Deal, which we have surveyed in some of its ideological aspects. We must be careful not to identify the New Deal and New Dealism with Franklin Roosevelt and his acts. Roosevelt is a brilliant and demagogic popular politician, who did not in the least create, but merely rides when it fits his purposes, the New Deal. The New Deal sprang from the inner structural drives of modern society, the forces that are operating to end capitalism and begin a new type of social organization, the same forces which at later stages and under different local circumstances produced the revolutions in Russia and Germany. The firmest representatives of the New Deal are not Roosevelt or the other conspicuous New Deal politicians, but the younger group of administrators, experts, technicians, bureaucrats who have been finding places throughout the state apparatus, not merely those who specialize in political technique, in writing up laws with concealed jokers, in handing Roosevelt a dramatic new idea, but also those who are doing the actual running of the extending government enterprises, in short, managers. These men include some of the clearest-headed of all managers to be found in any country. They are confident and aggressive. Though many of them have some background in Marxism, they have no faith in the masses of such a sort as to lead them to believe in the ideal of a free, classless society. At the same time they are, sometimes openly, scornful of capitalists and capitalist ideas. They are ready to work with anyone and are not so squeamish as to insist that their words should coincide with their actions and aims. They believe that they can run things, and they like to run things. It is important to insist that Roosevelt is not the New Deal in order to understand unambiguously that the direction represented by the New Deal is in no way dependent upon Roosevelt. In the general development, his presence or absence does not make 10% difference. With the advent of the New Deal, the rate of those changes, to which we have so often referred and some of which I have just listed, quickened. State intervention really got going. The percentage of the national income accounted for by direct governmental enterprises doubled in 5 years. A substantial percentage of the population became directly or indirectly dependent upon the state for livelihood. State controls of 100 kinds extended throughout the economy. Agriculture became wholly dependent upon state subsidy and control. Export and import regulations increased, moving toward the monopoly state control of foreign trade characteristic of the managerial state. Private control over capital funds was curtailed by acts governing the issuance of and trading in securities, and the structure of holding companies. Money left its free metallic base to become managed currency under the direction of the state. In utter disregard of capitalist-conceived budgetary principles, the state permitted itself annual deficits of billions of dollars and used the national debt as an instrument of managerial social policy. Tax bills were designed to secure social and political ends, rather than income. The state, through various agencies, became by far the greatest banking establishment. In general, measure after measure curtailed capitalist private property rights and thereby weakened the relative social power of the capitalists. In the United States the same shift occurred which had begun earlier on a world scale. The expansion of capitalist relations in the total economy was replaced by a continuous and growing contraction. The percentage of the economy subject to capitalist relations, whether measured in terms of outright ownership and operation or of degree of control, began to decrease at an ever more rapid rate. The managers, in the governmental apparatus and in private enterprise, flourished while the capitalists lamented among themselves about that man. Congress, with occasional petty rebellions, sank lower and lower as sovereignty shifted from the Parliament toward the bureaus and agencies. One after another, the executive bureaus took into their hands the attributes and functions of sovereignty, the bureaus became the de facto lawmakers. By 1940, it was plain that Congress no longer possessed even the war-making power, the crux of sovereignty. The constitutional provision could not stand against the structural changes in modern society and in the nature of modern war. The decisions about war and peace had left the control of the Parliament. Time after time this last fact was flung publicly in the face of Congress, by the hold-up of the Bremen, the freezing of foreign balances in accordance with policies never submitted to Congress, the dispatch of confidential personal emissaries in the place of regular diplomatic officials, the release of military supplies and secrets to belligerent powers, outstandingly by the executive trade of destroyers for naval bases and by the provisions of the Lend-Lease Plan, and by all that these two acts implied. The Parliament had so far lost even its confidence that it did not dare protest. The New Deal is not Stalinism and not Nazism. It is not even a direct American analog of them, for the New Deal is far more primitive with respect to managerial development, and capitalism is not yet over in the United States. But no candid observer, friend or enemy of the New Deal, can deny that in terms of economic, social, political, ideological changes from traditional capitalism, the New Deal moves in the same direction as Stalinism and Nazism. The New Deal is a phase of the transition process from capitalism to managerial society. There has been a mystery about the New Deal which has often puzzled and dismayed old-fashioned liberals, like Oswald Garrison Villar, who have on the whole enthusiastically supported it. The New Deal, as against the Tories, the Republicans and the right wing of the Democratic Party, has certainly seemed to be the liberal, the progressive side. Nevertheless, on a number of important and symptomatic issues, it was the Tories and Republicans who were lined up against the New Deal in defense of what was historically without doubt the liberal point of view. Such was the relationship, for example, in connection with the Supreme Court packing proposal, where the New Deal position was unquestionably directed against liberal and democratic institutions. So also in the case of the original executive reorganization plan, which was a heavy blow against parliamentary democracy, and again in connection with the attitude of New Dealers like Ickes and Roosevelt himself toward the press, or the whole question of a third term. So, indeed, in the case of many other of the New Deal measures, if their true significance had been realized. On these issues, it was the Republicans and Tories who were, apparently, defending liberty. Many of the Villar type of liberal found themselves compelled to desert for the moment the New Deal standard, and to line up with the Tories. How is this mystery, this paradox, to be explained? It is usually dismissed without much thought. The New Deal attempts to encroach on liberty are held to be well-meant but dangerous mistakes. The Tory defense of liberty is passed off as mere sham and camouflage. However, mistakes and shams and paradoxes of this sort do not happen in serious politics. Here, also, it is the job of a correct theory to get rid of mysteries, and from the point of view of the theory of the Managerial Revolution the paradoxes of the New Deal easily dissolve. The fact of the matter is that the New Deal's liberalism and progressivism are not liberalism and progressivism in the historical meaning of these terms, not, that is to say, capitalist liberalism and progressivism. Its progressivism, if we wish to call it that, consists of the steps it takes toward managerial society. Some of these steps have a surface resemblance to those traditionally advocated by capitalist liberalism. It was through this surface resemblance that the New Deal was able to take the genuine liberals, who are perpetually confused about the meaning of politics, into camp. But many of the New Deal steps are just the contrary of capitalist liberalism, and the historical direction of the New Deal as a whole runs entirely counter to the ideals and aims of liberalism. Some of the older generation of liberals, who are more principled and less adaptable than the younger crowd, finally woke up to this in 1940, and, like Villar himself, quite logically supported Willkie in the presidential campaign. There is nothing sham or hypocritical about the Republican-Tory defense of liberty. The liberty in question means, in reality, capitalist liberty. Historically and today the Republican Party is the authentic representative of capitalist liberty and capitalist progressivism. These it is trying to defend, without success, against the New Deal onslaught. The Republican Party, let us remember, was born in the social crisis that culminated in the Civil War. It is not the Republicans but the world that has changed. The New Deal has simultaneously been undermining capitalist institutions, and thus the social position of the capitalists, making easier the rise of the managers, and curbing the masses along lines adapted to the managerial future. How can this be denied when one abandons high-flown theories and looks at what has happened during the New Deal years? Can anyone pretend that during the New Deal years the capitalists and capitalist institutions have become socially stronger, the managers, including especially the managers in government, thrust into the background, the masses made more enthusiastic about capitalist institutions and ideologies? The very contention would be absurd. The New Deal has curbed the masses along lines adapted to the managerial future, in the first place ideologically, by using a propaganda that weakens confidence in the basic ideas and slogans supporting capitalist institutions, and popularizing ideas and slogans suited for the transition to the managerial structure. And the New Deal has further curbed the masses by tying the popular organizations closer and closer to the state. This development is characteristic of the managerial revolution in all nations. It is strikingly illustrated in the United States by the history of the labor movement during the New Deal period. The older section of the mass labor movement, the A.F. of L., has traditionally, in keeping with the limited state principle of capitalism, been careful to preserve a large measure of trade union autonomy, to avoid close tie-ups with the state apparatus, to rely on independent bargaining power just as private capitalists strive to keep independent status on the market. This policy was continued unchanged by the A.F. of L during the first 5 or 6 years of the New Deal. The C.I.O. was a product of the New Deal period. For several years, it was, on the one hand, favored, almost sponsored, by the government, and, on the other, it moved always toward integration with the state. Everyone knows the intimate relations that were in force between the C.I.O. and the National Labor Relations Board. The C.I.O. formed labor's nonpartisan league as a political arm, and the league was, in effect, part of the New Deal political movement. The C.I.O. functioned prominently and openly in the 1936 presidential campaign, and in numerous state campaigns. More recently, the New Deal government has been restoring a more general balance by withdrawing special favors from the C.I.O. in order to bring the labor movement as a whole, including the A.F. of L., into closer relations with the state apparatus. The A.F. of L., as a result, is abandoning its traditional standoff policy. Moreover, the history of the New Deal relations with farmers and consumers organizations parallels the labor movement tendencies. The examples of Russia and Germany have already taught us that the early forms of managerial society require fusion of the popular organizations with the state. The bureaucrats in charge of the popular mass organizations, in fact, take their places among the managers. This tendency, like the other managerial tendencies, is conspicuous in the New Deal. We must not, furthermore, neglect the significance of the capitalist opposition to the New Deal. After the first 2 years, when hardly anyone saw clearly what was happening, the capitalists have been overwhelmingly opposed to the New Deal. In the 1936 elections, probably 3/4 or more of the bona fide capitalists were against Roosevelt. In 1940 the figure must have been above 90%, and there was not even a handful of big capitalists supporting Roosevelt. Orthodox Marxists are very hard put to it to explain this simple and undoubted fact. They are compelled by their theory to say that Roosevelt and the New Deal represent capitalism and the capitalist class. Why, then, are almost all capitalists against, apoplectically against, Roosevelt and the New Deal? This, apparently, must be partly hypocrisy and partly because the capitalists do not understand their own interests. What a pitiful way out of a theoretical difficulty! And what a weak insult to the capitalists, who number among themselves not a few very intelligent persons. A correct theory cannot toss aside so revealing a piece of evidence as the almost united capitalist opposition to the New Deal. The simplest explanation which can cover the facts is here, as always, the best. This explanation is merely that the capitalists oppose the New Deal because they realize, without being wholly clear about the full problem, the truth, that the New Deal is in direction and tendency anti-capitalist. The capitalists, unfortunately for themselves, do not, however, have any program of their own to offer in place of the New Deal. They can only, as Landon did for them in 1936 and Wilkie in 1940, repeat the traditional capitalist symbolic ritual of liberty, free enterprise, the American way, opportunity, individual initiative. They repeat it sincerely, as their fathers repeated it before them. But the ritual has lost its meaning and its mass appeal. In order to reach any sort of audience, the capitalist spokesman must accompany it by protestations that they accept most of the New Deal reforms, they have nothing indeed with which to counter them, but dislike its methods. Such a dislike does not constitute a convincing program, as Landon and Wilkie discovered. The 1940 presidential election, which may well have been the last regular presidential election in the history of this country, or, at most, the next to last, was a symbolic landmark, a guarantee of the course of the future. The united capitalist efforts and resources, united as never before in United States history, could not elect their man. Those who represented, however incompletely and primitively, the managerial world current, carried the field easily and confidently. It was amusing to read the complaints of the hysterical New Deal type of liberal hanger-on that the Wilkie backers were evading the Hatch Act, spending $20 million or $30 million on the campaign and using the services of the biggest advertising agencies. They forgot, somehow, that the New Dealers had at their disposal every day more money than the largest sum they estimated for the entire Republican campaign, that they had all the other resources, direct and indirect, of the mighty state power, and that the New Deal propagandists were modeling their techniques on the methods of the European managerial politicians, not relying on the outworn rules for selling soap or perfume. The Wilkie backers, in truth, as Wilkie's own conduct on election night so eloquently witnessed, never knew what hit them. They did not understand what it meant to be up against, not a country squire from Dutchess County, but the rising tide of a world social revolution. The beginning of the Second World War, the first formative war of managerial society, found the United States unprepared to fill the role which opened up for her in the new historical era. Everyone knows that the United States was not adequately prepared in a military sense. Many are beginning to suspect, what is much more important, that the United States is not socially prepared, does not have a social structure able to cope with the tasks of the future. Wars, however, have the general habit of speeding up the rate of social change. When society is, as at present, already in a process of major transition, that is, in a period when the rate of social change is unusually rapid, the effect of war is especially dynamic. That this is the case with the Second World War, no one will deny. The natural perspective which confronts the United States follows from the world political problem that we have discussed. Within its own continental boundaries, the United States includes one of the three central areas of advanced industry. The United States thus constitutes naturally the nucleus of one of the great superstates of the future. From her continental base, the United States is called on to make a bid for maximum world power as against the superstates to be based on the other two central areas. For her to try to make this bid is hardly a matter of choice, since survival in the coming world system can only be accomplished by the expansive attempt. For the United States to try to draw back into a national shell bounded by the 48 states would be fairly rapid political suicide. Suicides are committed by nations as well as by individuals. But there is not the slightest reason to suppose that the United States will accept suicide. On the contrary, it is sure that she will make her bid. The general problem for the United States is very much the same as Germany's, only on the whole considerably easier. First, there is the consolidation of the main strategic base. In Europe, this consolidation meant smashing the continental political system. In the Americas, most of the base is already included within the boundaries of the United States. Consolidation therefore reduces itself primarily to internal measures, to strengthening internal unity and coordinated efficiency. Next comes the protective extension of the base with the aim of making it invulnerable for defense and convenient for attack. This, in current terms, is the policy of modified hemisphere defense, to draw a ring around all of North America and northern South America. The second stage is already well advanced. It was prepared for by the series of Pan-American conferences and agreements and by what is propagandistically referred to as the Good Neighbor policy. It has gone forward through such measures as the establishment of airlines throughout Latin America, the visits of warships and warplanes, the projection of the Pan-American Highway, the strengthening of the Panama Canal, reciprocal military agreements with Latin American nations, the defense alliance with Canada which in effect subordinates Canada's sovereignty to the United States, and the deal with Britain which secured outlying bases in the Atlantic. Naturally, this stage will not stop with these moves. It will issue in a situation comparable to what Hitler aims at in most of Europe, the de facto elimination of independent sovereignty in all nations and colonies of the area except the United States, and thus the creation of a single interrelated territory so far as de facto political sovereignty goes. There is every reason to suppose that this stage will be successfully accomplished. The third and grandiose stage, which, though it has already begun for the United States, will extend many decades into the future, and for which the first two stages are preparation, is the bid for the maximum of world power against the claims of the European and Asiatic Central areas. The United States is forced to begin this third stage before the preparatory first two stages are finished. The first great plan in the third stage is for the United States to become what might be called the receiver for the disintegrating British Empire. We are not, of course, interested in the propagandistic terms that are used in current references to this action. The attempt is to swing the orientation of the empire from its historical dependence on Europe to dependence on and subordination to the American Central Area. Success in the case of the English Dominion, Canada, and possessions located in the Americas is already at hand. In fact, Canada really swung into the United States orbit some years ago. There are obstacles to the plan, however, in the case of the more distant parts of the empire. Many of these fall more readily into the orbit of the Asiatic or European areas than into the American, and it is to be therefore doubted that the plan can be wholly carried through. We see here, again, why Hitler has always preferred a deal with England to conquering her completely. A deal with England gives the best legal as well as military groundwork for keeping the vast empire territories attached to the European Central Area, whereas in the process of the annihilation of England, the empire tends to swing toward the American area. Along with the United States receivership plan for the British Empire go still broader aims in connection with the rest of South America, the Far East, including conspicuously the far eastern colonies of formerly sovereign European states, and in fact the whole world. The struggle which has begun is the world struggle of the superstates of the future. This struggle, as I have remarked, is bound to be inconclusive. No one of the three central areas is able to conquer definitively the other central areas, and therefore no one state power can in fact rule the world. This will not, however, prevent the struggle from taking place. And, besides, there will be periodically decided just how much of the world will fall within the spheres of each of the superstates. I have outlined in chapters 12 and 15 the general forms of the wars and conflicts that may be expected. This, then, is the course set for the United States. It, too, is not a question of personal speculation. The United States has already embarked on this course, and is plainly going to persist in it with whatever deviations and interruptions. Roosevelt's speeches, from the time of the Dayton, Ohio, Hemisphere talk during the campaign, express the perspective more and more openly. This perspective for the United States follows from the general perspective of world politics in managerial society. But the perspective is for managerial society, presupposing managerial social organization for the chief participants. And the United States is not yet a managerial state. The capitalist social structure cannot hold its own in these scheduled conflicts. This we have seen in many ways, but we may review here certain evidences that are even now clear in relation to the United States and the specific problems which the United States faces. In the first place, capitalism cannot hold its own economically against managerial economic organization. This has been shown, in fact and by analysis, in connection with South America. The capitalist institutions, still prevailing in the United States, have proved themselves unable to handle the economic side of the South American problem. It is not profitable, in the capitalist sense, to integrate South America into a superstate dominated by the United States, and yet extension into such a superstate is a necessity for the political survival of the United States. Almost all able economists in this country are lately agreed that capitalist institutions, private initiative, will not hold up against the controlled managerial methods in an economic battle over South America. The South American problem is no different from the problem of the rest of the world. Nor can arming, not merely the building of armaments, but their coordinated use, be adequately done under capitalist institutions. Adequate arming, that is, adequate, for the tasks imposed, against rival arming, also is no longer profitable to capitalism. This, as I have noted, has been shown by the examples of France and England, who were not able to arm adequately, though they certainly realized what was at stake, under their capitalist institutions. It is being discovered by the United States during the course of the experiences of the Second World War. The armament program just doesn't seem to get going properly. It would be very superficial to attribute the trouble to the evil will of capitalists who own the armament industries or to trade unions or to the incompetence of officials. It is not ill will or incompetence, though these also, as under any system, are often present, but the institutions of capitalism that make the obstacles, owners who must have an adequate profit in order to expand and keep going, autonomous and independent trade unions with the right to strike, price changes under the influence of market conditions, capital funds at the disposal of private individuals, a governmental structure too limited in scope and too little coordinated. In the debates over excess profits and amortization allowances, over plans to conscript industry and to establish compulsory priorities and price controls, over the propriety of strikes in armament plants, there spreads the growing shadow of this fundamental problem, nor will that shadow be withdrawn. This does not mean that capitalist institutions are not still capable of very considerable armament efforts, enough, no doubt, to forestall for some years the resolution of the problem in the United States. But the efforts will prove, before so very long and perhaps most bitterly for many, not enough. Third, capitalist institutions and the ideologies affiliated with them are no longer capable of arousing adequately the popular morale, a by no means secondary part of the task for the future. This I have already commented on, and discussed in relation to the failure of voluntary military enlistment, as well as to the passivity with which conscription is accepted. It is further stressed by the inability of capitalism, in this case United States capitalism, to get rid of the fifth column. The fifth column can be got rid of, not by any conceivable number of G-men, but only when the ideologies and methods that call it into being can be challenged by at least equally effective ideologies and methods. From these considerations we may conclude once again that the United States will shift more and more rapidly, toward the managerial social structure. This is not a startling conclusion. It does not mean any shift from the historical direction of the past decade but, on the contrary, merely a deepening of the tendency already established. Thus the initial world struggle, begun openly in September 1939, will gradually merge into the world conflict among the rival sections of the managers. It might seem that certain events of the past year argue against this analysis. Roosevelt, it might be argued, has been granting concessions to capitalists in order to help national defense along. Granted that the New Deal is managerial in tendency, do not these concessions show that the effect of the war is to bring a reversal back toward the strengthening of capitalism? It is true that some concessions to capitalists have been made, though we should remember that there have been other concession periods in the New Deal history, as there have been in Nazi history, and that, in any case, Roosevelt is not identical with the New Deal. It may even be true that these might bring about a temporary relative strengthening of the social position of the capitalists and capitalist institutions, though Wilkie, as spokesman for the capitalists, scarcely seemed to think so. But the further effects of the war preparations, the wars, and the between-war interludes that are coming guarantee that the concessions will prove illusory. Modern total war is not profitable for capitalism, and consequently capitalism cannot adequately fight it. This was really proved by the First World War, which was unprofitable, as has often been shown, for the victors as well as for the vanquished. This was not the case with the earlier wars of capitalism, which were almost always profitable for the victors and often for the losers as well. Indeed, the unprofitableness of the First World War was an important demonstration of the fact that it was the last great war of capitalism. As a matter of fact, there are cruel catches in any concessions which might seem to have been made to the capitalists. Perhaps, though the stock market is not very optimistic, they permit larger profits. We have seen, however, that de facto control over the instruments of production, rather than a privileged share in the national income, is decisive in the long run. The constant effect of the war measures, even of the apparent concessions, is to decrease the control exercised by private capitalist owners. The weight of control is shifted toward the managers, in and out of government, along with their bureaucratic and military colleagues. In the First World War, armament production was run as a private preserve of the capitalists. As the Senate munitions inquiries proved, billions of dollars were siphoned off into capitalist pockets through the Autonomous War Industries Board, headed by the finance capitalist, Bernard Baruch. Even the name of the new agency, the Office of Production Management, is symptomatic. It is headed by William Knudsen, who, though closely affiliated through his past with the capitalists and no doubt in his own mind a firm believer in capitalism, is nevertheless by training and experience a production man, a manager. Moreover, the OPM, unlike the War Resources Board, is firmly anchored within the state apparatus. In all probability, the unions will be prohibited, either by statute or agreement, from strikes in armament industries, which can be interpreted to mean nearly all important industries. Though such a prohibition will doubtless be welcomed at first by the private capitalists, it will not mean that the unions will be left to the unchecked mercy of the capitalists. The managers will have other plans for the control of the unions, as of the industries. In general, the concessions will in the end turn to dust in the capitalist mouths. The further development of the war preparations, the economic world conflicts, and the wars, will prove in practice that success in none of them can be won along capitalist lines. When that proof is plain enough, the country will go over to definitive managerial structure. It will be seen that I take herein for granted that the United States will be in the war. This, also, is not much of a speculation. By earlier standards of the meaning of war and peace, the United States has been in the Second World War almost from its start. As I write, the United States Armed Forces are not being killed, but for this as yet the strategy of the present war has no need. Factories making belligerent airplanes in New York or New Jersey or California are as much a part of the total war machine as those located in Coventry or Southampton or Manchester. Warships and planes in preventive patrol of the Western Atlantic or the Far East are part of the warring fleets, even if the immediate circumstances of the war dictate that they shall not be fired on. The line between war and peace in the contemporary world is not so formally drawn as it used to be. From the point of view of historical development, and in terms of social effects upon this as upon other nations, the United States is in the Second World War. Indeed, by the end of 1940 it was correct to say that the United States had become one of the two major belligerent powers in the world conflict. Even though England was carrying the brunt of one side of the actual fighting, it was clear that her role had become, as it was bound to become, secondary to that of the United States. If this stage of the war continues without an interruption through a peace arrangement between England and Germany, it is plain that the United States will join the war in all respects during 1941. An interruption, however, would change only the time schedule, for the world political problems remain. In that case, formal war participated in by the United States, the opening stages of the Battle of the Three Central Areas, will begin in a comparatively few years. The pattern of the United States way to managerial society is, from all evidence so far, closer to the German than to the Russian pattern. This is to be expected from the closer similarity in general social circumstances. The United States, like Germany, has an extensive and advanced industry and technology, a culture which, though probably not as advanced as the German, is far above the Russian, and a large, able, and trained group of managers already existing. There are, however, as is also to be expected, differences between the United States pattern and the German. For one thing, the solution of the first two parts of the managerial problem, the reduction of the capitalists to impotence and the curbing of the masses along managerial lines, has up to now developed more gradually in this country than in Germany. This slower pace has been no doubt due to the more favored position, from almost every point of view, that the United States has enjoyed under the capitalist world system. But a far more important difference lies in the relation of the war to the decisive crisis that swings the nations from capitalist dissolution definitely into the managerial road, the crisis which the United States has not yet reached. Germany made the break 6 years before the Second World War began. It is in the midst of war itself that the United States crisis develops. The United States way is the war way. In order to take its place in the new era of world politics now opening up, in the new type of economic conflict and the wars that are an integral part of the new era, the United States will be compelled to go over to the managerial structure. Thus the United States must meet all three parts of the managerial problem: the reduction of the capitalists, the curbing of the masses, and the competition with the other sections of the managers, more or less at once, instead of by the rather clearly separated stages that we noticed in the Russian and German ways. Already, in the case of the United States, just as with the rest of the world, we may conclude that the direction toward managerial society is irreversible. Capitalism, in the United States as elsewhere, fights a losing battle. Every apparent victory the capitalists win leaves them only weaker, for their base is being constantly sapped. The next few years, war and near-war years, will thrust them always further back. A peaceful interlude, during which they might hope to regain their full rights and privileges, will find too much changed in the major institutions and relations of society to permit a return. Even if a return were institutionally possible, neither the managers nor the masses would permit it. Why should the managers and their bureaucratic military allies accept a return that would thrust them back into the servant quarters? They are servants who are learning to speak with the voice of the master. And, as in Germany, a return would present itself to the minds of the masses as the road back toward everlasting mass unemployment and breadlines, social meaninglessness, a lack of ideological perspectives. Therefore, however harsh the lot of the masses, they will choose to solve their problem by further advance along the managerial road, not by a return. If the governmental regime then existing attempts the return, that regime will be overthrown, and another, welded to the managerial structure, will be put in its place. There remains a further and, humanly, most important question. In the case of the United States, will a revolutionary mass movement, and the terror and purges that accompany such movements, be part of the managerial development as they have been, and will be, in Russia and Germany? Historical precedent and an analysis of present conditions do not make possible an assured answer. There have been instances of social revolutions carried through without revolutionary mass movements and without a major terror, in particular, when these revolutions, as will be the case for the United States and the present world revolution, are socially similar to what has already been carried through, with the aid of mass movements and terror, in other localities. Some sort of mass movement is undoubtedly required in the United States. The experience of the New Deal suggests, however, that it may be possible to create such a movement officially, we might say, from above, from the government itself. In fact, such a movement already exists, at least in primitive form, within the New Deal forces. The development of such a movement need not be at all the same as that of those movements which grow up apart from and opposed to the government and law and order. Given such a course, and granted reasonable goodwill and sufficient clarity about what is happening in the world, it is even possible that the United States could accomplish the transition to managerial society in a comparatively democratic fashion. Nevertheless, though this now seems possible, it is the less likely variant. There is not much clarity, and there is so much for social groups to lose, and to win. The capitalists are to lose all, or nearly all. The masses, during the course of the transition, will lose the hopes of a free, classless society which the circumstances of revolutionary transition will stimulate in them. There will be much struggle for places in the new ruling class. Revolutionary mass movements, terror, purges, are usual phases of a major social transition. Societies do not seem willing merely to change the old. At some stage they seem to wish to smash it, at least symbolically. It is more likely than not that these more strenuous features, also, will be included in the United States way. Chapter 17. Objections. I am well aware that the conclusions reached in this book will be displeasing to most of those who read it. Nevertheless, denunciation of the book, or of its author, will have no bearing upon the truth of these conclusions, if they are true. Denunciation may persuade people not to believe what the book says. But truth is a function, not of belief, but of evidence. The aim of propaganda is to persuade people to accept certain ideas or feelings or attitudes. The aim of science is to discover the truth about the world. The propagandistic aim is usually best served by being thoroughly one-sided, by presenting only what is favorable to your case and suppressing all that might weaken it and bolster your opponent. As Hitler remarks in one of his shrewd chapters on propaganda, you don't sell your brand of soap by pointing out that a rival brand is really just as good. In the case of any hypothesis which is under consideration, science, in contrast to propaganda, is always anxious to present all the evidence, for and against. The scientific aim is just as well served by proving a hypothesis false as by proving it true. This book, though faulty in execution, is scientific in its aim. I have no personal wish to prove the theory of the managerial revolution true. On the contrary, my personal interests, material as well as moral, and my hopes are in conflict with the conclusions of this theory. If there is evidence against the theory of the managerial revolution, I wish to take it into account as fully as the evidence for it. I have, during the course of the book, tried to include a discussion of negative evidence in appropriate contexts. I wish to return to it in this final chapter. I do not pretend to be at all complete in listing possible objections, since that would be outside my present scope. In this book I have had to restrict myself primarily to the formulation of the theory of the managerial revolution, a comparison between it and rival theories, a general outline of its meaning and content and the evidence for it, and a somewhat more specific application of it to the problems of world politics, of Russia, Germany, and the United States. There is a peculiar difficulty in giving due weight to the evidence against the theory. This arises from the fact that, so far as I know, The theory of the managerial revolution has never up to now been systematically formulated. Consequently, no one has yet had an opportunity to disprove it, if it can be disproved. I have been compelled to assemble negative evidence as well as positive. However, there have been presented, though somewhat roughly and incompletely, many of the elements of the theory as well as recognizably similar theories using the term bureaucratic rather than managerial revolution. And these theories of a bureaucratic revolution have been argued against. I shall make further reference to the arguments in what follows. In estimating the weight of the evidence against the theory of the managerial revolution, we must keep in mind an obvious principle of scientific method. To disprove the theory, it is not enough to show that it is not 100% certain, that difficulties confront it, and certain evidence seems to be against it. It must be further shown that it is less certain than alternative theories covering the same subject matter, that there are in its case more difficulties, more negative evidence than in the case of at least some one alternate theory. No theory about what actually happens and will happen is ever certain. It can never, whether in the field of physics or history or anything else, be anything except more or less probable on the evidence. If a given theory is more probable than any alternative theories on the same subject, then that is all that can be required, and, from a scientific point of view, we must accept it. The theory of the separate creation of biological species is not made scientifically acceptable by showing, as it can be shown, that there are serious difficulties with the biological theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is more probable than the theory of specific creation in spite of the difficulties. The theory of the managerial revolution will not be disproved merely by showing, as it can be shown, that difficulties confront it. It will have also to be shown that fewer difficulties confront some alternative hypothesis, in particular, either the theory of the permanence of capitalism or the theory of the proletarian socialist revolution, for variants of one or another of these include all the alternatives which have, so far, been seriously put forward. It is possible to object to the formulation of the theory of the managerial revolution. Objections of this kind are to be expected on opposite grounds, from some, that it is too vague, from others, that it is too precise. The theory is too vaguely formulated, it may be said, because it doesn't include any exact mathematical laws, any precise dates, any rules for calculating stock prices next Tuesday. Now there is no doubt that the theory is vague, in this sense, compared to theories in the physical sciences. This vagueness, however, is a comment not so much on this theory as on the relatively undeveloped stage at which sociological science today rests in general. With the exception of a few very limited ranges of their subject matter, the sociological and historical sciences have not yet reached even the level that the physical sciences held in ancient Greece. When we find elaborate mathematical laws in books about the general development of history and societies, we can be sure either that the authors are fooling themselves or that the alleged laws are false or empty. As Aristotle long ago wisely mentioned, it is a mark not of intelligence but of ignorance and pedantry to expect more accuracy in a field than the field is capable of. The theory of the managerial revolution is vague but not too vague to be significant. The test for the empirical significance of a statement is whether that statement and the deductions that may be drawn from it make any difference, any observable difference, as compared with other statements dealing with the same subject matter and the deductions that may be drawn from them. Most metaphysical and religious statements, such as all things are ideas or God created the world, are not empirically significant because it doesn't make any observable difference whether or not they are true. Most general theories of world history, like causal theories holding that destiny or God or economic relations or whatnot are responsible for everything that happens historically, are not significant, because, again, it doesn't make any observable difference whether or not they are true. But Boyle's law of gases is significant, because observable differences in the behavior of gases under varying pressures and volumes may be expected logically to follow from its truth or falsity. If we compare the theory of the managerial revolution with the theory of the permanence of capitalism or the theory of the socialist revolution, then it is plain that all three theories are significant, that is, it is plain that it makes an enormous amount of observable difference which of the three is true. The world that we will shortly live in will be a very observably different place if the theory of the managerial revolution is true rather than the others. Altogether different expectations and predictions, in most spheres of social life, follow from the three different theories. The theory of the managerial revolution is, indeed, more precise than this book suggests. Here it was necessary, because of the novelty and complexity of the subject, to present what is little more than a general outline. And month-by-month predictions do not have much point anyway in a book, where many months intervene between the writing and publication. It is, however, possible and easy to make specific probable predictions on the basis of the theory, more specific than the many predictions I have included, and to test the theory further with their help. Objections on the ground that the theory is too precise will probably be more frequent than those based on its vagueness. Many people seem to be offended by definite statements about what is going to happen in human history. It is felt to be a kind of sacrilege. They say, nobody really knows what is going to happen. They prefer to think that it is all accident or God's will. This attitude is partly a reflection of the primitiveness of sociological sciences to which I have referred. It is true that these sciences are not very helpful guides. But the attitude has an even deeper root. People, for the most part, do not want to know what is going to happen, and, above all, the ruling groups in society find it advantageous to keep knowledge about what is going to happen in society from developing and extending. If politicians say before election that they are not going to lead the country into war and then go to war after election, it is obviously more advantageous to them to have people regard this as an unfortunate accident, or punishment, than to have it realized, when the pre-election promise is given, that, in spite of the words, going into war is a predictable consequence of what is being done. Naturally, a capitalist does not want it believed that mass unemployment is a predictable consequence of the maintenance of capitalist institutions under present-day circumstances. Unemployment, also, is to be considered an accident or exception. Nor do the managerial ideologues wish to have it publicly pointed out in advance that their proposals will bring, not peace and plenty and freedom, but a new form of class rule and exploitation. Nevertheless, the general methods of the social sciences can be no different from those of the other sciences, and the same type of results can be obtained. We try to arrange our data in an orderly manner, and, on the basis of past experience, we make probable predictions about the future. If we don't yet know society as we know the solar system, we yet do know, if we want to, something about it, and, as in the other sciences, we can know at least some things, with some degree of probability, before they happen. Because it lets us know what is probably going to happen before it happens. That, after all, is why scientific knowledge is worth having. I conclude, therefore, that the formulation of the theory of the managerial revolution is adequate. I recognize, however, that the formulation can be greatly improved and clarified, and I hope that others more skilled than I in these matters will so improve and clarify it. The more important objections are those that may be made not to the formulation of the theory but to what it says, to its content. Two of these have been advanced in criticisms of the similar theory of the Bureaucratic Revolution. This latter theory, insofar as it has been stated, agrees with the theory presented by this book in holding that it is false that capitalism is going to continue and false that socialism, in the sense of a free, classless, international society, is going to replace capitalism. The theory agrees also with much of our account of the structural features of the new society now developing, especially in the case of the economic institutions. The differences in the account of the political structure, which are considerable, need not concern us. But the theory of the bureaucratic revolution maintains that the ruling social class in the new society, the class with power and privilege, will be, exclusively, the bureaucrats, that is, the politicians in the narrower sense, those who carry out the non-productive functions of political administration, diplomacy, policing, and fighting. A sharp criticism has been made of this view on the ground that the bureaucrats are not capable of constituting themselves an effective and stable ruling class in society. Social rule, it is argued, depends on de facto control of the instruments of production, the means whereby society lives, and such control can be held only by some group which plays a direct and integral role in production. The bureaucrats have no such role. They can achieve a temporary semblance of dominance in society only under exceptional and brief circumstances of social confusion, when they are able to utilize for their own purposes the conflicts among other classes in society which do have a direct role in production. The bureaucrats, it might be said, balance for a while on a kind of social tightrope between the major social classes. In such a way the bureaucracy under Napoleon III of France gained a brief independence and dominance by playing French capitalists and peasants and workers off against each other. So, in our own day, have the bureaucracies in Russia and Germany been able to do, for a brief while, in the former case, jockeying between the Russian workers and peasants, in the latter, between the German capitalists and workers. But, so the criticism runs, such a state of affairs cannot last. The weight will have to fall, sooner rather than later, to one of the great social classes directly functioning in social production. When it does, the bureaucracy will have to swing with it and lose all measure of social independence. This criticism, upon examination, may be seen to be weak even in relation to the theory of the Bureaucratic Revolution, and without any validity in relation to the theory of the Managerial Revolution. The criticism is largely based upon a widespread misunderstanding of contemporary bureaucracies, which amounts to a confusion between them and the bureaucracies of a few generations ago. In the old days, it could be plausibly stated, as it was, that the functions of the political bureaucrats were non-productive. Veblen included them in the leisure class, though the view even then was only partly true, since production as men actually carry it on includes diplomacy and war and political administration and policing. The state, then, as we have so often insisted, was strictly limited in its sphere of activities. Production was, for the overwhelming part, carried forward outside the state sphere. Under such circumstances, the bureaucracy could not have been, and was not, the ruling social class, in spite of superficial appearances. The ruling class was the capitalists, who controlled production. The bureaucracy, by and large, represented the capitalists and, on the political field, acted in their interests. The contemporary bureaucracies, above all in those states which have moved furthest toward the new social structure, are functionally a quite different group from the old bureaucracies. The new bureaucrats are not merely concerned in production, they are directing, in all nations already, the biggest enterprises, and, through various types of control, they have their hands in almost all enterprises. Moreover, as we saw, even the bureaucrats still primarily occupied with government in the narrower sense are applying to their tasks the techniques and methods taken over from modern industry and science and invention. It is a ridiculous caricature to think of the modern bureaucrat, as many still think of him, in terms of the fussy, briefcase-carrying incompetent whom we read about in 19th-century novels. This caricature lies back of the criticism that the bureaucracy is incapable of becoming a ruling class. When we correct the bureaucratic theory by the managerial theory's demonstration that it is not the bureaucracy, conceived in any narrow sense, but the managing group which is becoming the ruling class in society, the criticism falls wholly. The managers are certainly concerned directly in production. Indeed, the development of modern industry places them in the key positions of production even before the transition to managerial society takes place. Before the managerial structure is consolidated, the managers function throughout enterprise, both private and governmental. With the consolidation of the managerial structure, which includes the state monopoly of all important enterprise, the position of the managers is assured. To a large extent, as we saw, the managers and the bureaucrats fuse into a single class with a united interest. Far from being incapable of constituting a ruling class, the managers, by the very conditions of modern technology and contemporary institutional evolution, would have a hard time avoiding rule. Just as the struggle of the capitalists against the feudal lords was largely won before the open stages of the struggle began, so too is the struggle of the managers already fairly well decided in the initial period of the transition, before men realize explicitly that the struggle has started. It is perhaps worth remarking that there is an interesting piece of psychological evidence for the assured social position of the managers. The managers, these administrators, experts, directing engineers, production executives, propaganda specialists, technocrats, are the only social group among almost all of whose members we find an attitude of self-confidence. Bankers, capitalist owners, liberal politicians, workers, farmers, shopkeepers, all these display, in public and private, doubts and fears and worries and gloom. But no one who comes into contact with managers will fail to have noticed a very considerable assurance in their whole bearing. They know they are indispensable in modern society. Whether or not they have thought it out, they grasp the fact that they have nothing to fear from the immense social changes speeding forward over the whole world. When they begin to think, they get ready to welcome those changes, and often to help them along. A second criticism which has been directed, chiefly by Marxists, against the bureaucratic theory, runs as follows: The solution of the major problems confronting modern society requires the elimination of capitalist private property in the instruments of production. This the bureaucrats, for which we may read managers, are able to carry out. But elimination of private property is not enough. If society is not to be destroyed, national states must also be eliminated, and world political unity established. This the bureaucrats, managers, are unable to do. On the contrary, they gain power with the help of a nationalism even more extreme than capitalist nationalism, and thus lay the basis for an unending series of wars. It may be noticed that this criticism, if valid, would not in the least, as the Marxists imagine, go to show that socialism is coming. It would only indicate that complete chaos, the destruction of all organized social life, is coming. However, the criticism is not valid. In the first place, the nationalist ideologies of the managers are misunderstood. The nationalism is a device for social consolidation, the effectiveness of which has been well proved by experience. It is, however, a device of great flexibility, and one which can be modified as need arises. It is, as Germany and Russia and Japan have certainly proved, not at all incompatible with the breaking down of existing national boundaries. Germany, consolidating initially to the tune of the German fatherland and the German folk, easily extends this to Europe and Europeans or to the Aryan race or to workers or anything else that proves convenient. Extreme Japanese nationalism dovetails neatly with a pan-Eastern ideology and practice. The present rise of extreme United States nationalism is not exclusive, it fits itself in readily with the hemisphere policy, and it will have no trouble getting outside of the hemisphere. Second, the managers can solve the problem of capitalist nationalism, are, in fact, busily engaged in solving it. Capitalist nationalism means a comparatively large number of independent, sovereign national states. The managerial structure is moving to break this political system forever, and to substitute for it a small number of great sovereign areas, the superstates, as I have called them. It is true that this managerial solution is not according to the Marxist formula and that it will not yield a unified single world state. It is true also that it will lay the basis for many wars, just as wars are part of the process of arriving at it. But there is no one or nothing, except ideal formulas, that requires the logical solution of one world state and no more war. History is not a theorem of geometry or a game of chess, both of which proceed according to ideal rules that we impose upon them. There is no evidence that men adopt those historical solutions which seem logical to a calm mind of goodwill, and there is plenty of evidence that men fight wars and will continue to fight them. The capitalist nationalist political system has, during the past generation, become unworkable and is on its way out. The New World political system based on a small number of superstates will still leave problems, more, perhaps, than a unified single world state, but it will be enough of a solution for society to keep going. Nor is there any sufficient reason to believe that these problems of the managerial world system, including the managerial wars, will destroy civilization. It is almost inconceivable even what it could mean for civilization, that is, some form of complexly organized society, to be literally destroyed. Once again, what is being destroyed is our civilization, not civilization. A different kind of criticism of the theory of the managerial revolution has, and will, run as follows. You conclude that society is changing to a new structure of class rule, exploitation, wars, and, for some time at least, tyranny. But you neglect what most people want, what they feel and hope for, what they will do. Why should they put up with such a perspective? If they want peace and plenty and freedom, they will sweep aside your managers and managerial institutions and anything and everyone else that stand in their way. I would be the last to deny the historical importance of what people want and feel and hope for. I have not the slightest sympathy with any theory of historical mechanism or determinism which pretends that human wishes and thoughts and wills have nothing to do with the historical process. It is, it seems to me, perfectly obvious that human wishes and decisions and hopes are an integral causal part of the historical process. But a correct historical theory also takes into account what people are probably going to wish and hope and decide. Human wishes and decisions are themselves part of the world of actual events, and, as with other events, on the basis of the experience of them in the past we infer what they will be like in the future. When, on the basis of experience, I know a man's character, I can have a fairly good idea, in advance, of what he will probably say and want and do under varying circumstances. Even more fully in the case of social groups can we know with some probability beforehand what they will do, granted such and such a situation. Everyone knows just about what a football crowd at a big game will eat, drink, feel, shout, and hope, and groundskeepers and hot dog salesmen plan successfully on the basis of such foreknowledge. If most people did indeed want peace, plenty, and freedom from all forms of exploitation and tyranny, and if, what is just as necessary, though less often remarked, they also knew the means whereby these were to be got, and if they were willing and courageous and strong and intelligent and self-sacrificing enough to bring about those means to those ends, then no doubt the world would achieve a society organized in such a way as to realize peace, plenty, and freedom. But there is not any evidence at all from past or present history that all three, and all three would be required, of these conditions will be met. On the contrary, the evidence of the analogies from the past and the circumstances of the present is that people will act and wish and hope and decide in ways that will aid in the managerial revolution, in the carrying through of the social transition which will end in the consolidation of managerial society. This last criticism, about the human factor, reduces to a more general fallacy. When we deal with the problems of history we usually misread them in terms of what we hope instead of understanding them as the evidence dictates. And I suspect that most objections to the theory of the managerial revolution will be found to rest on hopes, not on evidence. Clarity about what is happening in the world has been blocked in recent times by unexamined acceptance of one or the other of the two assumptions which we have so often noticed, the very naive assumption that capitalism is the only possible form of human social organization because it is somehow a part of eternal human nature, or the more common assumption that in modern times capitalism and socialism are the only possible alternative forms of social organization. Not only do these assumptions prevent us from knowing what the future is to bring, they compel us, more and more during the past 2 decades, to distort and twist our understanding of what is happening before our eyes. The second of these assumptions, merely by being stated, disposes of the first. The theory of the managerial revolution, as soon as it is formulated, disposes of both so far as assumption goes. Instead of assumptions, we are left with 3 theories, hypotheses about the future: that capitalism will continue, that capitalism will change into socialism, that capitalism will change into managerial society. The problem is, then, which of these 3 theories is the most probable on the evidence? That will be the theory which we must believe, if we wish to be rational, quite apart from what, if anything, we may decide to do about it. On the evidence so far available, I see little doubt that the theory of the managerial revolution is the most probable. There will be those who will find in this a renewed proof of what they will call the essential tragedy of the human situation. But I do not see with what meaning the human situation as a whole can be called tragic, or comic. Tragedy and comedy occur only within the human situation. There is no background against which to judge the human situation as a whole. It is merely what it happens to be.